If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, people who experience sleep paralysis, what was your scariest run-in with demons or creatures like? I am Mexican, and my good friend's mom has a story about this that chills me to the bone every time. In her village in Mexico, one night she woke up to a dark, demon-like figure sitting on her chest, and she could not get up. Fearing for the safety of her young son, who was awake and playing in the room at the time, she told him, "Go to the neighbor's house and ask for help." And he, not seeing the demon, said okay and went next door. The demon then turned back to my friend's mom and started to taunt her. She just swore at it and tried not to be afraid until finally it stood up, climbed off, and walked out through the walls. She went outside to go to the neighbor's house, where her son was, but stopped to see the whole village standing outside their doors with baseball bats and kitchen knives. She asked what happened, and they all claimed to have seen a dark figure walk straight through their walls and through all the houses down the street. No one ever spoke of it again. But on a funny note, her son had forgotten why he was sent to the neighbor's house and just told them he was hungry, and they fixed him a snack. I get to see this demon about once a month. Usually somewhere near the full moon, which is odd. It starts out with me waking up. I can always tell what is about to happen, so I try to scream and wake someone up to shake me out of it. If that does not work, I try to move my limbs and force myself to roll out of bed and wake up. This typically does not work, so I know it's time for the visit. A shadow forms along the floorboards of my bedroom and starts going up the walls. I can then feel the presence of radio or TV static. This shadow starts to form into a demon, similar to the early renditions of Slenderman. He has no eyes or face, just little balls of static where the facial structure should be. He slowly starts edging closer and closer to my face, and the volume of the static rises, and I can feel it very lightly shocking me. It then puts me in some weird trance by grabbing the sides of my face and screaming directly into it. This is the scariest part. The scream is so shrill, I can't even describe to you how terrible it is. As this happens, the room starts to turn red, and these giant arms start to form into long spikes. So while I'm stunned or hypnotized, it starts taunting me with the spikes. Rubbing them around my neck and heart, etc. He then reaches up and stabs me directly in the throat, and I wake up. I've experienced sleep paralysis a few times in my life. The first time was the worst. Back then, I didn't even know that something like sleep paralysis existed. I was probably around 13 or 14 at the time. I remember waking up and hearing a really loud scrapping sound. I thought it was my father, because his legs are sick, and that's sort of the sound he's making when he's walking. I remember trying to move, but I couldn't do anything at all. I could barely breathe, I couldn't close my eyes, and I couldn't make any sound at all. I was starting to panic, desperately trying to say something or just move a little bit. The sound was getting louder and louder, to the point that I could barely stand it. I also started feeling pressure on my chest. That's when I saw a strange head in front of me. I remember the head being male, skinny, and bald, its ears were sticking out, and it had a sort of bluish color. The head started talking to me, but the only thing it said was, "You have to warn her." After it said that, the head started to fade away. After it was gone, I started regaining control of my body. I was completely terrified, and my heart was beating like crazy. First time, I watched a figure darker than the pitch black room walk from the hallway into my room. Then it bent over at the waist and, seemingly, stared at me, about 6 inches from my face. Then it tried to rip my heart out of my chest by choking down on my ribcage. Trying to scream was useless for what seemed like eternity. I was completely frozen. Finally screamed, "Guess I was coming around," and it exploded into a cloud and dissolved. Second time, I was playing in a metal band and crashed at our bass player's apartment. Had all sorts of pentagrams and various hell-loving metal posters all over the walls in the living room. I was on the couch and watched the same dark figure I'd seen years before walk into the room and sit in a chair across from me. She stared again and pointed at me until I could finally scream. This time it just dissolved, there was no explosionish thing. It's probably happened 3 or 4 other times. The horrible part is, I didn't know what the dark man or sleep paralysis demon was until about a year ago. I've spent the last 20 years or so believing a demon was following me and liked to ruin my month from time to time. But until you see that SHT and feel how real it is, you won't get it. Imagine, if you will, waking up, and all you can see are tones. No color. And then suddenly realizing that you're actually seeing the insides of your eyelids, and you can't even open them. And then I realized that I couldn't move. Not one bit at all. I couldn't even twitch a toe. Normally, I would have been fine with this, but for one small, very insignificant problem. I felt there was a presence in the room with me. And I don't mean a ghost or a spirit, they're not spirits per se, they're more like a recording, repeating over and over. This was something else. And it was coming towards me. For those who haven't made the mental leap yet, this is something you do not want when you're paralyzed. My fight or flight response was going completely batshit insane, and I was unable to do either of these things. I was pinned there, like a chair glued to a wall with no more nails. And then I had a sense of what this thing was. Utterly evil. Positively demonic, in fact. All I could see were the hands. Gray, wizened hands, cracked with age, or evil, I didn't know which. There weren't any nails, either. There were claws, filed to rough points. And this pair of hands was coming towards me, pinned on the bed. They may have been connected to something else, or not. My mind wasn't exactly up to thinking about this at the time. So, to sum up, I was pinned on the bed with some kind of gray demon hand coming at me. Slowly. As though they were enjoying the complete and utter fear and terror I was experiencing at the time. And then it occurred to me to mentally shout for help. And then I saw, felt, and became aware of a light, the brightest I have ever seen or will ever see. Brighter than the sun. It was like the primordial light of the universe came to my aid to burn whatever this thing was that was coming towards me to ashes. My bonds were loosed, my muscles started working, and my eyes shot open, and thank duck, it was over. Ducking sleep paralysis. I was lying in bed when I woke up. I could look around the room, moving my eyes, and see my alarm clock changing to the next minute and my ceiling fan swirling, but I could not move my body at all. Everything in my room was as it should have been, except for one thing. Near the foot of my bed, against the wall, were two thin closet doors. These doors have never been in my room before. To my unbelievable terror, the doors opened, and I watched this decrepit old woman stagger slowly around my bed until she was leaning over my chest. To say I was terrified would not do it justice. I have never been that scared before, and I don't know what I could do to recreate that level of terror. As she stalked over me, I felt a large amount of pressure on my chest and felt as if she was draining some kind of energy from me. My terror grew to new heights. I tried to fight back, but my body wouldn't move. I tried to scream, but it wasn't working. Being paralyzed is terrifying enough without being attacked by a creepy old lady. Then, in a flash, it was over. I was still looking at the same room, but the old lady and the closet doors were gone. It took me hours to calm down and finally go to sleep, with the lights on. It gets crazier. I don't believe in ghosts. I think events such as mine can be explained, but one thing still freaks me out. A month after having this episode, I decided to do some research on sleep paralysis. I came across many interesting facts. Many people will suffer from this once in their lives, and there are paintings depicting this phenomenon as early as 1781. But the most disturbing thing I found was a picture of something called the Old Hag. This picture I found was of the same old lady I saw in my bedroom. Apparently, some people might see a demon sitting on their chest, among other things, and others might see an old, decrepit hag. There are all of these people who happen to see the same creepy image of an old lady. Insane. I knew there was something in my closet. Something really evil, but I also knew I was dreaming and I should face my fear. I tried to look directly at the closet door, but if I moved my eyes, my head would turn away. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't look directly at it. Then I woke up in a cold sweat. At first, I felt really relieved that it was over, but very shortly, I realized it wasn't a dream and there really was something in the closet. I was laying on my back and couldn't move, and I didn't really hear it, but I could kind of feel this sickening laughter wash over me and through me in waves, emanating from the closet. All of a sudden, the thing throws a human head at me, and it lands on my chest, face up. It was this girl from high school. Up to this point, I was kind of holding it together, terrified but not panicked. Well, I lose it now, I can't even scream. All I can do is make these grunting and moaning sounds. I'm wriggling and straining, trying to rock from side to side to get it off me, but I can't move. This seemed to last maybe a minute or two, and then I really woke up. It was so traumatic that for weeks I would be scared when I woke up that I wasn't awake and something horrible could happen at any second. It still makes my skin crawl when I think about that laugh. The thing is, I had never heard of sleep paralysis or night terrors at that point in my life. I thought I was losing my mind. I've had sleep paralysis my whole life. I have very distinct memories of it as a child. I would always start with me waking up, and there would be a man in my room in the corner, standing over me, etc., and I would scream for my parents, but nothing would come out. Just quiet air, no matter how hard I tried to scream. Once I entered college, it started getting worse, and I would feel the men run their hands over my body and stuff like that. I'm lucky I never had paranormal hallucinations like lots of people do, but it's really scary to truly believe there is an intruder in your room and he's about to kill you, and you can't scream. The scariest experience was earlier this year. I woke up and saw a man in all black disguise crouching at the edge of my bed, moving onto my bed, and I started to scream. I had this tiny shred of relief knowing that this is how all my sleep paralysis dreams are and that after a little while of trying to scream, I would get to wake up. Except I actually screamed. I ducking screamed. And I heard my scream echoing in my head, and I screamed more and more. It was real. There really was a man who entered my room. Years and years of the same nightmare finally coming true I've yet to recover. About 4 years ago, I had been suffering from sleep paralysis almost every night for months, waking up constantly feeling like I was going to be attacked. When I would go into paralysis, it would just feel like there was an evil thing in my room. Sometimes it was in the corner of my room, sometimes next to my bed, sometimes like it was hovering over the bed. It had a very masculine presence, and it always gave off the vibe that it was furious at me. The thing I dreamed had a very distinct voice, one that I can't even imitate while thinking about it. I only know how it sounds when I go into paralysis. If that makes any sense. One night, I started to get that feeling, and, in my head, I decided to fight back. So I started chanting in my head, "You're not real. You're not real. You're not real." The thing goes, "Oh yeah? Watch this." As soon as it said that, my daughter, who was 3 at the time, started screaming her head off in her room. My so and I leapt out of bed and rushed to her room, which was thankfully right next to ours. She was up and out of bed, on the opposite side of the room, screaming her head off, shaking in fear, and crying. I have never seen her that scared before or since. She just kept saying that someone was throwing skeletons at her. It freaked me right out. Later on, once everything was calm and I was back in bed, I told whatever the thing was that I didn't care if it tormented me every night, but leave my daughter alone. In the 4 years since, she hasn't had another nightmare that scared her like that. My sleep paralysis hasn't been as bad as it was back then, though I still get occasional visits. I'll never challenge it again, though. I used to have sleep paralysis on a monthly basis. Most of the incidents were basically the same. I'd be sleeping on my back. I could see the room, but I couldn't move my eyes. Usually, dark figures would appear in the peripheral of my vision. The figures would terrify me. I had to scream myself awake. Usually started as a low growl and developed into a scream. My significant other could testify to this. But a few occasions stand out. Once, I had a dark figure whisper into my ear. It was some sort of nursery rhyme. The craziest part of it is that it was mono. I could only hear it in the ear that was being whispered into. The scariest part was that I was surrounded by dark figures, and they were stabbing me in the abdomen. The pain was so intense. I went to the hospital that morning because my appendix had burst. Long ago, I read somewhere how to force yourself into a lucid dream, but instead it just forced me into sleep paralysis. For the first few minutes of this, I was terrified because I couldn't move and felt like I couldn't breathe. After that, I started hallucinating or dreaming, I'm not sure, that there was a tall black figure in the corner of my room. Eventually, a slim white figure crashed through my window, and they both dissipated. At this point, I was concerned about the glass on the floor, and I'm not sure why. Anyway, after those events, the rest of the night was actually intensely boring. I had realized that I could breathe and made every attempt I could to move, but I couldn't still. I ended up just sitting there staring at the walls and thinking about my situation and the glass on the floor. I had several lesser hallucinations through the night, but they were oddly tame compared to what I've heard, and I can't remember most of them. Later in the night, I simply fell asleep. I remember this so clearly, I must have been asleep for about an hour when it all started. I had opened my eyes and briefly moved them about scanning the room, without moving my head, and I noticed a person walk in front of my bed across the room. He was dressed all in black with a hat on. Imagine a Van Helsing looking person, but I could never distinguish the face. I thought he was a burglar or something and that he was trying to rob me while I slept. In my mind, I was going to wait until he was digging through a desk to the left of me and spring up and subdue him. I heard him start muttering something, but I couldn't understand what he was saying. I believed this was my chance and attempted to spring out of bed with all my might, but lo and behold, I could not move. I let out a muffled loud enough that after the predicament, my neighbor knocked on the door to see if something happened. That's when the creepiest part happened. I heard the man who was just standing next to me say, "You can't move, can you, boy? This is what it feels like to be helpless," in a Hannibal Lecter/Anthony Hopkins voice, and he let out a maniacal cackle, which, when I think about it, still makes the hair on my neck stand up. I closed my eyes and tried again to spring up, and I sat up in my bed with such fervor that I sent the whole bed and frame sliding across the floor. My entire body ached as if I were just lifting weights, my heart was beating out of my chest, and when I looked to the left of me, nothing was there. Needless to say, I didn't sleep for a few days in fear of it happening again. The worst case of sleeping paralysis was when I was severely deprived of sleep due to depression or stress. I woke up hearing whispers outside my door. It sounded like random people speaking in tongues. It was disturbing. Since I was still sleeping at the time, I somehow started to sleepwalk. I could not control myself, even though I felt myself physically walk out of bed. I headed towards the door, opened it up, and the whispers started to become louder. I looked at the end of the hallway, and I noticed that the sound came from there. So naturally, I headed towards the whispers, which became louder and louder as I approached. I opened the door to our walk-in closet, in which I saw this demon standing there looking at me with his eyes that gleamed brightly. As soon as I saw this demon, I saw it launch at the door, and I, still in my sleep, fell backwards and screamed. This is the first time I have ever been this scared from a dream. I thought I was literally being attacked, and I couldn't tell if I was still in this dream or not because of the transition. I had an insane adrenaline rush. I woke everyone else up, as they thought I had been attacked. One thing I have learned after this event is that even a little sleep deprivation will mess around with my brain. Even after LAN parties, I'll take a nap, and sometimes I get into a sleeping paralysis without any hallucinations. Oh well. I've experienced sleep paralysis for over half my life. Relatively frequently. But there are 2 times that really ducked me up. One was when I was really young, probably 12, and I saw a little girl crouched in the doorway of my room who suddenly sprinted full speed, still crouched down, and went directly under my bed. It made me get rid of my bed frame. I didn't want an underbed anymore. I didn't get another bed frame until college, when I moved in with a boyfriend. The second was when I was a bit older, maybe 18, and heard dogs snarling and barking at the foot of my bed. I couldn't see them. They were invisible. But I saw their owner. He was a shadow person I hadn't seen before. I got the feeling he was holding the dogs off. I figured the dogs were hellhounds. I don't usually get auditory hallucinations, so it freaked me out. He came back once a few years later and tried to take me out of my body. I recognized him as the same guy. I've had multiple, but I think this was the worst one. It started with a dream. You know those dreams that feel more like you woke up and lived an entire day? I was having one of those dreams, dreaming that I had woken up, gone to classes, worked, etc. Except during the entire dream, it felt like I was being watched, like there was someone just on the corner of my line of sight, following me from place to place. Then, in the dream, I got home and went to sleep. Sleep paralysis starts. I hear banging from my front door, like someone is trying to break in, before a louder sound that feels like the front door is torn off its hinges. Then I hear the sound of things being dragged around, as if someone decided the quickest way around the living room was by literally throwing the couch and table out of the way. As they get to the corridor that leads to my room, I can hear heavy steps and heavy breathing. Through all of that, I'm trying to stand up and move, but I can barely breathe. The most I can do is move my head around, and not much. Then something kicked in my door. Once, twice, and it gives. I can't even see what it was, just a tall shape in the dark room. It gets inside and comes closer and closer. And I wake up. Jumping and punching at nothing, falling out of bed panting. This was the only time I woke up in such an aggressive way, so I guess it would be the worst one yet. I've had sleep paralysis twice. The first time I had it, I dreamed that there was a monster watching me while I lay in bed. It was watching me for a short while, then it suddenly ran towards me and bit down on my head. Obviously, I was scared like duck, and I knew I had to wake up, but I couldn't no matter how hard I tried. It actually began to feel like there was something biting my head because it felt like my head was going to explode with how hard I was trying to tell my brain to wake up. Eventually I woke up, and my heart rate was through the roof. The second time was weirder. I was trying to get to sleep for like an hour with no success, then after staying awake for about 15 minutes because I couldn't sleep, I closed my eyes. It pretty much started instantly. It wasn't a dream because I couldn't see anything but blackness. It was literally as if I couldn't open my eyes or speak. It also felt like I couldn't move, but I swear I did a little bit. I was trying so hard to scream because I was terrified. It literally felt like someone had put tape over my eyes and mouth so I couldn't open them. After struggling and trying to say something with no success for about what felt like 20 seconds, I was finally able to open my eyes. That one was pretty scary. I haven't had it again yet. I've got a strange demon. He is old, like 50 years old, is bald somewhat, and has a very satanic face with a beard. He grabs me from behind and seizes me so much that I scream and scream until my mom or brother comes to my room to wake me up. This doesn't happen when I am sleeping straight or on the left side, it happens when I am sleeping on the right. That means that even without any weight on my body, I feel him. It has been 4 months since I last saw him. I am poor at drawing, but I've seen him so much that I can describe his facial features. As a child, 2 to 4 years old, I knew my Victorian bed was haunted. Every night, a group of gnomes would sit on the end of it, pulling faces at me, laughing, and making rude gestures while I was frozen, unable to call for help or even just hide under the covers. Oddly, my little sister wound up in that bed and tells me she had nightmares that exactly matched the ringleader of my nightly visitors. I assume I must have told her about them, but neither of us remember talking about it. As an adult, it's altogether more threatening but much less frequent. I have 2 visitors, never on the same night. The less threatening one is a gray, humanoid demon with smooth skin, red-pink gums, long claws, and large muscles. He sinks his claws into my leg and tries to pull me from the bed. I can't move, and it only goes away when I manage to scream and my husband wakes me up. Sometimes those can last for what feels like hours. Worse is my Hat Man. Hat Man doesn't cause me physical pain, but he stands next to the bed or in the corner of the room while I am suffocating and paralyzed. When I get this one, thankfully rarely, there's an intense, visceral sense of mindless terror. It sinks into me and causes anxiety for days afterwards. In the light of day, I am not afraid of any of these things, arachnophobia crew here, but I can't convey the fear they inspire when I'm helpless. I've only had a sleep paralysis incident once, thankfully, and it was terrifying. At the time, I had a closet with no door that was full of junk in the opposite corner of the room from my bed. There's no way anyone could fit in there. I'm laying on my back, almost asleep, when I feel this weird sensation, like electricity in my entire body. I try to roll over, but I can't move, so I start to panic. Then I open my eyes. The first thing I see is the closet, with a bony white hand in its frame. Slowly, a woman in a white gown sort of floats out. Her eyes were dark and sunken in, and she stared directly at me. After a few minutes, she started drifting towards me, sort of floating. She opened her mouth as well. Almost normal at first, but as she inched towards me, it grew unnaturally wider. With each passing second, her cheeks began to tear as that hole grew. And that sensation intensified. I couldn't do anything but watch, and I can't describe how painfully slow it was. It felt like hours passed in nothing but terror until I started to feel her weight on top of me, compressing my chest. Her nails dug into me, and it felt like fire. Then, finally, her face was close to mine, almost nose to nose, with her gaping maw wide open enough to swallow my entire head. And then I passed out. Maybe from fear or exhaustion, but I woke up in a puddle of sweat. I don't really believe in the paranormal, but I salted the duck out of my room the next day. I've seen some shit, but the one that scared me the most was the banshee one. I heard a soft cry come from somewhere in my house, and I figured that maybe my brother or sister must have been scolded for something. Then it got a bit louder. I was starting to get curious as to what happened, and when I tried getting up, my body felt numb and immobile. The panic didn't start setting in until the cry got closer, just now outside my bedroom door. I still couldn't move, no matter how hard I tried to get my body to respond. Then the door began to creak open, an ominous, heartbreaking cry growing clearer and louder. It kept getting closer, and it kept getting louder. Not once did I ever open my eyes in fear of seeing something so horrific that I'd never forget it for as long as I lived. The horrible, blood-curdling screams only grew louder and louder. Closer and closer. Until I could feel something howling in agony right into my ears. I felt like my ears were going to burst and shatter, and spit fell on my face as it continued screaming nonstop. In my terrified soul, something compelled me to open my eyes. A spark of courage, or simply because the pain in my ears was spreading across my face. I saw a figure obscured in moldy, old bandages draped around a gray, matted body floating over my bed as it howled like it wanted to kill me with sound alone. Its rotted maw, putrid tongue, and yellowed, shriveled teeth were the one clear glimpse I got before I could look no more. I prayed to die, to let my heart finally give out so the horrid screaming would finally end. And with the same rising pitch with which it came, it also drifted further and further away until it sounded like nothing more than a child's soft sniffling. I would have cried if not for my fear of bringing it back and the fact that I still couldn't move. At least not under my own power. Something brought me up suddenly, forcing me to sit up in bed, turn to my closet, and force my eyes open. My closet door was open, and though it was night and already dark, the space in my closet was so much more. Wild, random whispering voices filled my head, calling out in an unintelligible, incoherent noise from beyond the void, growing louder as they sounded panicked and stressed that I was looking at them so directly. My heart raced, staring into the dark nothing of my closet, until my gaze was forced forward and an unseeable force shoved me onto the back of the bed and threw the covers over my face. I slowly regained the ability to move, but no part of me dared to budge an inch. I think the worst part of it all is that it was a recurring sleep paralysis episode I had up in the northeast of the US, and it never happened again after I moved out of that apartment. I don't want to entertain any idea involving what happened those nights as anything but fictitious, intense sleep paralysis episodes. I'd never had sleep paralysis before I moved to my new apartment, which I now believe is haunted. It's a 1-bedroom, 1-bathroom house with a big room that has a connected kitchen and living room, and you can see the kitchen from the bedroom. I live there alone. I'm a man, if that matters. I actually had 5 very different and vivid experiences. 1. My latest experience happened pretty recently and was terrifying but minor. I was lying on my side, facing away from the door. I felt the entity standing right next to my bed and close behind me, and I heard it say my name in a very sinister voice. Remember that this is very vivid, it was as if I could hear them in real life. I could also see the entity in my mind, some sort of monster wearing a black robe, but as it is with dreams, it did not have many details. It wouldn't have made any sense for me to be able to see it either since my back was to it, but I guess that's just how it works. As soon as it said my name, I turned around to face it. The act of physically turning woke me up, nothing was there, of course. I remember that part vividly, but leading up to it, I vaguely remember the feeling or realization that there were several entities in my room quietly discussing me. 2. One sleep paralysis of mine was highly auditory. I was lying on my back, and I could see my bedroom and into my apartment kitchen from the door as if it were daytime. My brain's ability to reconstruct the apartment so vividly still amazes me since it was in the middle of the night and there is no way it could have been as light as it appeared to me. Anyway, I could hear someone rummaging through my kitchen and living room, making a lot of noise. One distinct noise I remember was crunching as if eating cereal. I wasn't scared, but I was actually kind of angry that this entity was making my apartment at his disposal. I think I fell into a deeper sleep after this experience rather than waking up. 3. Another short one was when I saw some sort of ghost banshee type woman coming towards me from my bedroom door, howling. Think of the stereotypical movie ghost, transparent, blue, floating with ragged robe-like clothes. It kept approaching me, screaming, for what seemed like a long time, but the door is not that far from my bed. I remember trying very hard to scream back, but of course I could not since I was in a paralysis state. 4. The scariest one that I have experienced involves some sort of evil pizza man/pyramid head hybrid. The reason why I think Pyramid Head is because earlier that day or perhaps a few days beforehand I had been reading a walkthrough about one of the Silent Hills, and apparently there is a cut scene where a Pyramid Head is raping some other monster. I have not actually played the game. I like to read random walkthroughs of games sometimes. Anyway, this entity didn't have the Pyramid Head and instead had a normal human head with sort of spiky black hair. The face either had no details or I couldn't remember them. It was wearing a white apron or robe-like thing similar to PH, though. He was seemingly carrying a pizza box. So this thing is standing in my doorway and says to me, "Want some pizza?" No? Yes, it sounds like a horrible joke, but I explicitly remember this happening in the dream. Then he proceeds to jump directly on top of me and start humming me to the rhythm of a song he was humming. I don't remember the song, and it may not even have been a real song, but the rhythm sort of reminds me of this song. I think that the entity was also singing some words. As he did this, I was struggling very hard to move. The act of me trying to move my upper body back and forth woke me up. Thankfully, I was not actually being attacked by anything. It was mildly traumatic. 5. My final statement exemplifies that sleep paralysis is not all bad. This time I was on my back, and there were a bunch of people outside my apartment, a few guys and a few girls, who were having that sort of after-party banter as if they had come back from watching a movie or a nice casual dinner or what have you. There were no actual words in their speech, but I could see them pretty clearly. Obviously impossible if it were real since they were outside. It was actually pretty comforting, and I like the feeling of seeing people come home after a good time. One of the girls with very short, brown hair is now in my apartment. She goes into my bedroom and proceeds to undress, standing at the edge of my bed. I can't remember if she took off her bottoms, but she definitely took off her top, and I could see her small breasts. This dream entity doesn't seem to know I'm there. Perhaps I was not there in her reality, But she crawls into my bed and lies down in a fetal position next to me, lying on top of my arm. I lift my arm up. Of course, this act wakes me up, and the dream vanishes. I fell asleep on my belly once and woke up suffocating into my pillow. This wasn't my first experience with sleep paralysis, so I was telling myself not to panic and to focus on getting my body moving so I could push myself off of the bed. I lived with my parents then, and their house had very old, hardwood floors. So while I'm trapped face down in my own bed, slowly suffocating, I start to hear something. The loud creak of my bedroom door sent my left eye darting around the room while my paralyzed body anchored me down and hindered me from seeing the area the sound came from. I then heard the sound of heavy footfalls on the hardwood thumping loudly towards my bed. A lot of people will tell you that when you live in a house with hardwood for long enough, you start to recognize familiar footsteps. Well, I had no clue who this was. I was frantically moving my index finger in a futile attempt to push myself up and face my would-be attacker. The footsteps stopped immediately next to me, and I stood there for what felt like an eternity. I then heard the change in atmospheric pressure, which could only mean that the object was leaning closer to me. I could only listen as he said something into my ear in some language I wasn't familiar with. It wasn't long before I could push myself up to find my door shut and my room completely empty. Honestly, in hindsight, I think my brain fabricated the idea of a World War II German soldier. I've always found the idea of that war particularly scary. I've had cycles of sleep paralysis for as long as I can remember and regularly see two different demons. The hallucinations are visual and auditory, and you can physically feel them at times. They have become more vivid as I've gotten older. One is a tall, dark hooded figure that always stood at the bottom of my bed. My scariest experience with him was when I woke up one night with sleep paralysis and the big, spooky, hooded bastard was standing right next to me. His hood was covering his face, but I knew he was watching me, and I knew he was evil. The second one I see is a smallish gremlin type creature that's got pointy features and is a browny green color, very similar to the one in the painting, but I had seen him before I had seen the painting or even knew what sleep paralysis was. He normally appears when I'm on my back, restricts my breathing, and speaks in a weird whispery language. I woke up once, and he was crouching in the corner of the ceiling. When I looked at him, he turned his head, looked right at me, and smiled. I woke up on my side once, and I could hear him behind me speaking in his freaky language, and then I felt his snake-like tongue going in my ear and making a slithery noise. I can't tell you how glad I am that I found out that there was a scientific explanation for it and that I wasn't actually being haunted. I can't explain how so many people with sleep paralysis see similar demons and how we all just know that the things we are seeing are evil, but it's something I choose not to think about too much for the sake of ever being able to sleep again. I have only had sleep paralysis once, but it was the most terrifying moment of my life. I don't think the demon was for me, but it was there. It was a very rough time for my family. My sister Amy had been missing for at least a year, and we all feared the worst but still had hoped she would be found. I had just sold all of my possessions and moved back in with my father, who normally remodels houses but was laid up after a kickboxing injury. My father, sister, and I are all bipolar with varying severity. He was very depressed, as was I. I awoke late at night in a dark room, and I was unable to move. There seemed to be a darkness swirling around, almost like tentacles of pure black smoke pointed towards my father's room. The feeling of panic was overwhelming. I couldn't move and I couldn't breathe. From above, there was a bright light that came down and calmed me. It was Amy. She told me that she was dead and that she was no longer suffering. She was okay, but she was worried about my father. She thought he was going to hurt himself. All of a sudden, I could move again, and I screamed for my soul. The darkness faded, and I went to my dad's room and asked him if he was okay and told him that I loved him and that I saw my sister in a dream and she wanted him to be okay and loved him. He didn't know what I was talking about and went back to sleep. I don't know if I saw my sister that night, and I don't know if there was something else there feeding on our misery. I never felt that level of dread and panic again or woke up unable to move. I started grieving for my sister that night. I knew in my heart she was dead and no longer suffering. They found her body years later in a fairly deep grave. Some kids were out by the river and found a bone. The police say that outside of some miraculous jailhouse confession, they will never know what really happened, but they do think she was murdered. I'm not a superstitious person. I always believed, even since I was a child, that my sleep disorders, including paralysis and lucid dreams, were neurological in nature. Then one night, something different happened. It had never happened before and has never happened again. I had short out-of-body experiences before, mostly just limbs popping out or sitting up and leaving my body lying down. It's hard to explain. The following occurred after many of these experiences, so I was not afraid or shocked by them at this point. It's par for the course. One night, as I was trying to fall asleep, my arm fell through the bed. Obviously, my physical arm was still lying on the bed. Usually when this happens, I just pick my arm up, but this time I got curious. How long would it last? So I started waving my arm around, and my shoulder slipped through. This was new and exciting. I moved my fingers around, swung my arm around some more, and got bold. I consciously attempted to push my head through the bed. It worked. But what I saw was nothing. I don't mean I couldn't see, but it was as if something was, in fact, nothing in this place. I must sound totally bonkers right now. I could feel, though, that there was something farther away. My fear being exactly zero at this point and my curiosity impossible to control, I threw caution to the wind and tried to reach out as far as I could for whatever it was I could feel out there. Big mistake. My leg slipped. The rest of my torso slipped. My other arm slipped, and my hips started to fall in. At the very last moment, when my left leg was all that was attached and it was about to go, I realized somehow that what I was reaching for was not something I wanted to interact with. There was fear. Of an intensity equal to my rage during sleep paralysis. Fear like I've never experienced. At this point, I tried to pull back, but there was nothing I could do. I tried to swing my leg back up to smash into my body, but it was stretched down. Like being pulled into a void. My other knee slipped, and nothing but my foot and ankle were holding me up at this point. I was pretty sure I was about to be gone. Whatever that means. Just at that last second, something reached in, grabbed my shoulder, and yanked me back up. Like it was nothing. I can't really explain this properly either. The hand felt solid. Powerful. Like I was in its natural habitat. It pulled me back up with all the difficulty of lifting a cotton ball. I slammed back into my body with a feeling of finality. As if to say, no ducking way, I'm letting you fall into that. Directly and immediately into a state of sleep paralysis. This is the one time I just laid there. No fear, no rage, no attempt to move. My instincts said whatever was pinning me down had just saved my ass from something I probably never want to understand. I've continued to have regular sleep-related issues since that day, and to my shame, I've continued to react as I always do. I rarely have any reasoning ability during my episodes. Just running on pure instinct. But I can tell you with absolute certainty that if what I was falling into was your infinity, you want nothing to do with what's on the other side of it. And your witch might just be doing what he or she is doing to save you from it. Think about it. Just for a moment, I'll take a superstitious lane. What would it feel like to have your soul locked into your body so that it couldn't be pulled out? Probably a lot like paralysis. I still wish I could, thank you. I have a few different sleep paralysis demons and one sort of sleep paralysis guardian angel. The demon ones are the usual shadowy figures standing over me or by my bedroom door. The worst one was while I was lying on my side with my back to the door, and it felt like someone got into bed behind me, under the covers, and put their arm around my waist. Then it felt like they were cuddling into me, and I could feel their breath on my neck. It felt like they cuddled me for about half an hour. All this time, I've been trying not to show that I'm panicking because it feels like I'm getting cuddled by a skeleton with claws. It was only about the second or maybe third time I'd had sleep paralysis, so I nearly had a heart attack when this thing felt like it was moving in closer to kiss me behind the ear. Worst of all, it whispered, "Not yet. You're not ready yet. I'll come back when you are." To me, it sounded both disappointed and excited. It felt like it was silently telling me that it meant that it was coming back when I was about to die. Scared the ducking shit out of me. My sleep paralysis guardian angel was a weird experience. I've been getting sleep paralysis on and off for about 18 months by this point, so I could usually tell right away when it was happening. At first I thought it was the usual demon things beside my bed, but when I looked properly, I realized I could clearly see a man kneeling next to my bed smiling at me. It wasn't a creepy smile. More like a parent coming in to check on their kid. He looked like he was dressed in a 50s style suit and hat. He didn't say anything. Although I got the sense he was letting me know everything was alright and he'd look after me. The strangest thing about my sleep paralysis guardian angel was that I felt like I knew him. It's almost like when you see a relative you were around a lot while you were really young and then didn't see for years. If that makes sense. I only ever hear about people seeing demons. I've always wondered if anyone else has seen any guardian angel type things as well. Mine never came with visual hallucinations. I had the first one when I was 19. I was sleeping in the living room on a mat, young, broke, no bed, and suddenly I felt a hand on my throat and one on my abdomen pulling my soul through the floor. Unlike many of these stories, I did not think I was awake. I knew I was asleep. Usually, when I was having a bad dream, I could tell myself to wake up, but not this time. I tried to move, knowing that this would wake me up. I couldn't. I could open my eyes. I even saw my roommate's boyfriend come out to the kitchen for water. I couldn't wake up. Finally, I managed to push myself up with one arm and wake up. But I could still feel the hands grasping and warming. And I was so tired that all I wanted was to sleep. But every time I would start to go back to sleep, those hands would be pulling my soul back out of my body. I finally got up and went into the roommate's room and began watching TV with her and the boyfriend. Even in the room talking to her, I could still feel her hands on my throat and abdomen. Eventually, they wanted to sleep, so I went back out to sleep in the living room, but the hands were still there. Still waiting to drag me down. And I was still so tired. Finally, I decided to try sleeping on my side, and it worked, sort of. The hands were still there, grappling and trying to pull me down. But they weren't able to get a grip. I slept. The next was about a year later. Then every 6 months. But they were not as bad as the first one. I would wake up, and they'd be gone. Then I got pregnant, and they began to come more frequently. Always the same. There was always a hand coming and grabbing my throat and pulling me down. I was never choking, my soul was always just being pulled down through the bed to hell. Interesting, though, is that when I was in the hospital, while they still came, they no longer came at me from under the bed. Instead, I'd feel a hand reach from the bottom of the bed, feel its warmth as it grasped my ankle, and try to pull my soul out that way while my soul fought to stay in my body. By the time I had my baby and went home, they were nightly, and I was so tired. But every night they'd come again. I reasoned that it was just a dream and couldn't hurt me, and one night when it came, I just thought, whatever, just do what you're going to do and get it over with, still telling myself it was a dream. I knew as soon as the thought formed that I most definitely did not mean it, but it was too late. The dream changed. There was still no visual, but it was like I was in this maelstrom of wind buffeting me from all directions. But it wasn't windy. It was hands. Grasping. Grabbing. I tried to break free. Tried to wake up. I couldn't. Then came a thought, let us have your baby, and we'll leave you alone. You can always get help for him later. That was enough. Now I'm mad. So I called out, God, get them out of here. And they were gone. The weirdest part is that they never came back. I've experienced it 3 times. Unfortunately, the third time is lost in the memory banks, but I was positive it happened to me 3 times. As for the 2 other times, the second time I experienced sleep paralysis, I was just stuck in bed while my children and ex-partner, still living together but in separate rooms, were all screaming about a black cat in the hallway, warning me and each other not to get out of bed because the cat would kill us. Yeah, it's just a cat, but in the throes of sleep paralysis, it was the most horrifying, evil, and dangerous thing in existence. The first time I had sleep paralysis, it was far more terrifying. I was lying in bed watching TV when I must have fallen asleep, but it was as if nothing changed at all, aside from the fact that I couldn't move anymore. The TV show was still on, it didn't change at all, but it became background noise in comparison to what was going on in the kitchen. My bedroom door backed onto the kitchen, and even though I couldn't move, I could still see the bedroom door. An intense light was radiating around it and under the crack at the bottom. I could only hear what was happening out there, I couldn't see it, but in my mind, I knew what was out there. In the kitchen, a huge, demonic, or alien beast was tearing the doors off the cupboards and smashing everything inside them. It roared and smashed around in a rage because it wanted me, but because my door was shut, it couldn't get to me. Eventually, I was able to raise a finger or wiggle my toes or something and soon broke free from the paralysis, but only in the form of an OBE where I was able to float over to the door and look under the crack, but when I did, the room flipped upside down and I was sent back into my body, paralyzed again. A small girl appeared in the corner of my room, her hair was black and covered her face, and even though she sounded like she might have looked like Samara from The Ring, she had good energy. She had blue overalls that had a skirt bottom, leggings, and a red and white striped shirt on. Luckily, she felt calm, because that SHT is scary. She began singing Incy Wincy Spider, and the noise in the kitchen began to fade. She was singing to calm the beast outside. The creature's rage as well as the dread in the atmosphere began to settle, and I was able to wake up. Reality set in, and everything felt normal again except that I still heard the girl singing Incy Wincy Spider after fully waking up. It began to fade eventually, but even though I could no longer see the girl and felt like I had woken up, her voice still rang out for a good 20 seconds. That's the part that has stayed with me. This was all in 2014 or 15, and I haven't experienced it since.